Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first webinar of our updated CISSP short course, a certification study aid and overview presented by IT Masters on behalf of Charles Sturt University. My name is Guy Coward, and I'll be your MC for this course, excluding next week's webinar. Your mentor is George Thomas, who I'll introduce shortly. Wherever you're watching this, we hope you're safe and well and excited, as we are. Before we begin, though, just a little bit of housekeeping. All webinars for this course will be held at 7:30 p.m. Australian Eastern Daylight Time, with recordings made for those of you who cannot attend on a given occasion. Despite these recordings, if you can make it, we'd love to have you attend the live webinars and help create a collaborative learning environment. Part of that environment is quite clearly Zoom, which we use for our webinars, and we really encourage the use of questions and chat throughout the course. We ask that you direct all questions relevant to George's course content to the Q&A section, and that you send all administration type questions, dates, times, course details, resource availability, all that sort of stuff, to Hannah and the support team in chat. You can chat with just us, or you can chat with all of your students as well, and I prefer you do that. You can make that choice once you open the chat log. There's usually some really experienced attendees, as well as some really, fresh attendees. So it's really useful to get sort of some of the simpler questions answered by the more experienced people, so we don't interrupt the flow of the webinars. I guess insights that you have help augment our content. And there's going to be a lot of you here, so with so many of you here, it might be a bit wild to start in the chat, but it will settle down, so don't worry. We'll have Q&A sessions at the end of each webinar. And if a question is particularly relevant, I'll just interrupt George and we'll discuss it there and then. For those of you who have never taken part in a short course with us, first of all, just a special welcome. IT Masters is a training organisation that exists as a partner to Charles Sturt, who we work with to create and deliver a number of master's courses. We also market these courses on their behalf and figure that the best way to do that is give some of it away, which is what these short courses are. If we do a good enough job, then students will be encouraged to enrol in a full master's or a grad cert if it suits them, if it all fits. With that said, of course, these courses are hopefully useful and rewarding. We want to share some interesting information with you, have some fun together, and help folk make connections, either in their field or in a field they want to get into. So there's like close to 10,000 people who've enrolled in this course so far, so it's quite an opportunity to build a bit of a network or build on an existing one. So Hannah's around wearing the cogs for IT Masters as usual. Thank you, Hannah. She's also responsible for the course page learn.itmasters.edu.au, which is where you'll find all the other materials needed for the course that George has put together, links to readings, other useful resources, the discussion forums and quizzes, the exam at the end of the course as well later on. If you have any questions tonight or later on about the course page, we've got some contact details up there, so contact us using those. Just to signpost a little bit, we'll talk a bit about CSU next week and give you an idea of what studying with us is about and how these short courses can help you in completing a postgraduate course with Charles Sturt. So if you have any questions about that, just sort of maybe hold them over and we'll answer them next week. Finally, it's time to welcome back George, who's a perfect example, I think, of the IT Masters mentor, given that he manages to be both an academic and a beacon of the IT industry. He earned a master's and PhD with Charles Sturt University, and then a swag of industry certifications, spent time stateside developing more skills, and now he's giving back, teaching and developing a bunch of our technical postgrad cybersecurity subjects. And best of all, I think, he's also worked on several free short courses now. And it's a great pleasure to say hello once again, George. Please make him welcome in the chat. G'day, George. Happy 2022. What stories since your last short course?
There we go. Thanks, Guy. Thanks for the introduction. Stories. Look, my last short course, I can't even quite remember when it was. It was September. I just don't remember if it was last year or the year before or the year before.
It's all blended in, isn't it?
It's all blended in. But look, yeah, look, thanks everyone who's come along tonight. We actually do have quite a lot to get through, so I figure I should probably just get started.
Yeah, and George, George, we've got so many people here, and it's going to be such a huge night. Don't worry too much about time. If it runs long, we've got the recordings. It's just a question of how much time you can give.
Too easy. Yeah. So as Guy pointed out, so this is and as you already know because you've signed up for it, this is the CISSP sort of study session. I'm going to just start moving the deck forward, but it's a fairly big certification in that it has a lot of content, and so there's a lot to get through, and I would probably say that in 4 weeks it's pretty condensed. So the way that it's been, or the way that I've structured it is, so there's 8 domains in the CISSP, which I'll talk about in a minute, and I've divided those into the 4 weeks to try and best fit them in as I can, and then and then there's like a weekly quiz, and then an assessment at the end, just to kind of test your knowledge. So anyway, so yeah, you can just see here. So module 1, 2, 3, 4. I guess that aligns with week 1, 2, 3, 4, and then each of the domains. And as you can see, there's 2 or 3 per week. So to get started, so many of you may be familiar with the certification. Some of you may not be familiar with it or not know much about it. So I'll kind of cover it off quickly. Effectively, the CISSP, so Certified Information System Security Professional certification, is issued by an organization, a professional organization called ISC². Please don't ask me what that stands for. I think actually, hang on, maybe I know this: International Information System Security Certification Consortium. There you go, because it's like IISSCC. So it's a non-profit, and they specialize in training and certification for cybersecurity professionals. I think one of the great things about this certification is it's vendor agnostic. So it really looks at knowledge and expertise and building out a sort of leading cybersecurity program, and that's and it's considered to be the by many to be the not all, to be the gold standard in certification. And I'm sure any or many of you that have seen the information security, cybersecurity industry is pretty hot, and you'll see like job advertisements and so forth asking for this particular certification. It's described as mile wide, inch deep. So in other words, it covers a lot of information. There's the 8 domains. It's very, very broad. I'm probably gonna say it's a little bit more than inch deep, but it's not like super duper technical. But you do need to know a lot in terms of from that sort of wide perspective. And so I got my CISSP, I think back in 2015, 2016. So I've had it for about 6 or 7 years now. And so look, a bit of background on me. I mean, Guy kind of covered off a little bit, but I came from I've been in the industry, the sort of information technology, information security industry. I've been in the IT industry for about 22 years now. And I started in purely IT, but I always had an avid interest in security, and I kept working to kind of get there. And then about 10 years ago, I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to move into that field, and then work over in the States. And so this is when I got the certification. I'd probably already been in InfoSec for probably about 4 years, 3 or 4 years, but I've been in IT for probably close to 13, 14 years. And I'm going to talk about that too, because it's probably quite useful information for anyone that's going to go down the certification path around experience in the domains, because there are requirements for that, which we'll talk about probably on the next slide. So how do you get certified? As I said, we're going to just cover this off, anyone that's not familiar with it. But effectively, there's professional experience requirements in the CISSP domains, and from memory, I've actually written this down. I think it's 5 years of full-time paid experience in at least 2 of the domains. So there's 8 of them. So in 2 of them, you'll need 5 years of full-time paid experience. There are some concessions, there could be like a 1-year reduction for an accepted certification or relevant degree. But one thing to note is I've had many people come up to me and say, oh, look, I want to do my CISSP, but like me, I've moved from IT into information security and I haven't got 5 years of information security experience. And therefore they went, oh, well, so I can't get certified. So the important thing is the domains, right? So you need to have the certification in the two of the domains. And so, for example, and I use this as the example all the time, is if you're in a role where you're like, managing, user access or something like that, chances are you've already done work in those domains. You just haven't had a security title, but you've actually done the work and you have the knowledge and you have the experience. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind. If you kind of sit there going, well, I want to wait a bit longer, because that is something that is an option potentially. The test, so there's you prepare for the exam, so you do these sort of sessions, or you can read the textbook. You can do practice exams. We'll talk about a little bit about that in a minute. And then you book with the testing center, and you go sit and pass the exam. I remember when I did the exam, I can't exactly remember how many questions there was, but I think it was over 200. It was a 6-hour exam. It was pretty crazy. I was lucky because I had I'd already sort of had the voucher. My employer had paid for it, so I didn't kind of go in there with the stress of like, oh, if I fail. And I was lucky. I got through first go. So, and one of the things for me as well is because I'd already done some of the other certs before that, like I'd done the and I know there's mixed opinions and so forth, but I did the CEH. I had CISM as well, which is the ISACA certification, and so I had a couple certs, and a lot of it kind of prepared me as well for this particular exam. So anyway, once you do that, you effectively become an associate of ISC squared. And so, you could do that now. If you don't have the experience, you can sit the exam, pass it, and become an associate of ISC squared. I think you've got a period of time where you have to then get the requisite professional experience. But let's say you do, then you need to find an endorser. So that's somebody else that has a CISSP who is willing to, validate your experience. And so, trying to make it easy for that person, I tend to recommend, the spreadsheet approach. So, look at the domains, which ones you've experienced in, provide some notes, provide a copy of your resume, that sort of thing, so that, makes it easy for them. But yeah, you could do that to then have them, endorse you. So if they're happy to do that, great. It's just an online process. You apply, you pay your annual maintenance fee, all that sort of fun stuff, and then they'll just, have to review it and say, yes, I've reviewed this person, or I know them, and I validate their experience. So that's kind of the process. And then yeah, every year you've got to do the annual maintenance fee. There's some continuing education requirements. So you have to, keep your knowledge up to date, things like that. But that's pretty much the process of getting certified. And sorry, I said when I was talking about the exam, I talked about the exam that I did, which was, it's like 240 questions, whatever it was, 6 hours. That's now changed. So the test is now, I think it's only about 3 hours long. Only, it's still 3 hours. But the new test, which obviously I haven't sat, but it is adaptive. So it'll ask between 100, 150 questions. It's adaptive, so it'll make sure that you can know your stuff. And the one thing that is different is that you can't go backwards. So when I had mine, you could go forward, you could go backwards, you could flag things. Now you can't do that. So that is different. So yeah, fun. So that's the process of getting certified. I'll sum that up pretty quickly, but like I said, time. So talking about the CISSP domains. So there are 8 domains. For anyone that's looked at the previous version, and there's been iterations between, I can't remember what year the previous IT Masters CISSP session was. I think it was kind of maybe 2012, 2013.
Yeah, 2013, I think.
Yeah, so it used to be 10 domains. And so it got dropped to 8. I know when I did it, it was 8. There's been some changes since then. but these are the 8 domains. So security and risk management, asset security, security architecture engineering, communications and network security, IAM, so then the access management, security assessment and testing, security operations, and software development security. So as I said, in terms of that professional experience in those fields, identity and access management, potentially a systems administrator or an engineer probably will have experience in that. So even though they don't have a specific security role, chances are they've worked in that field. Same thing, communications and network security. If they're a network engineer or a network administrator, then chances are they've worked in that field. So just kind of keep that in mind. Service delivery people may have worked in asset security. I mean, there's all sorts of considerations and opportunity to have experience in those domains, but not be in a specific security role. So if anyone that was wondering, so now this is by no means mandatory, but if anyone is wanting to then go and do the exam, I would strongly recommend picking up a copy of the text. This particular session follows this text and the readings are from this text. The other great thing that I found, and so when I did mine, I bought probably about 3 or 4 books. There was the official IC squared CBK, or the Common Body of Knowledge book. It was big, it was thick, it's like a telephone book. It wasn't bad. It's very heavy, I give it that. I think there was Sean Harris's book that I had that was also pretty good. And I had this book. And I think the Sean Harris book at that point, because I believe she passed away, wasn't updated at that point. So, well, I don't know if anyone's updated since, but so I got this book because this was the kind of, well, not the 9th edition. I think it was like the 2nd edition. And I found this book really good, and it had a test bank. So for practice tests that came with the book. So you just kind of sign on, and you got to work out, go to this chapter and what's the answer to this question, and then it would give you access to the online test bank, which I found really, really useful, because a lot of those things help you kind of understand how the actual exams are structured and that sort of thing, and kind of kind of drill that knowledge into your head. So this book's been, I thought, was really good. So if you if you're looking for a text, then this one's good. Okay, that was the what do I do with questions? Do I just wait till later? Because normally I would pause here. But...
No, they'll be flying in thick and fast. A couple of quick ones we might get out of the way though. Can Dr. George be our endorser?
I didn't mention that only because I end up with I don't want 10,000 requests for endorsement. Look, so let me think about that. Normally I would say, generally I would probably be okay with that, but I guess if you really can't find anybody else.
well, George, this is where the beauty of the short courses, really comes in. It's the network opportunity as well. So we have forums in the short course page. So maybe it'd be a good idea to sort of have like a matching thread where people who are experienced and willing to share that and do some endorsing would be, happy to take a few, put their name down, and people who are seeking one can put their name down as well, rather than just flood George with thousands of requests.
Yeah, like I want to be helpful, but I'm reluctant to go, yeah, sure, because there might be a few of those flooding in. But like I said, let's go with the chat. And as I said, if you really can't find anybody else, then I'm sure we can work it out. So, and I've endorsed other people before. So, but yeah.
Yeah, and Rajat's wondering, that's fine. We'll figure that out through the next few weeks. And Rajat's asking whether you can have 2 endorsers if your experience is sort of split up over different jobs.
No, so you only have 1 endorser. So as I said earlier, the best thing to do, and we could probably talk about this maybe in the forums a bit more, but is to provide, and as sort of spreadsheets, what I've tended to recommend, like kind of lay out your experience in the domains, find an endorser, and provide them as much information as they can, so that they can review that and say, okay, well, this is what you're saying is experience in this domain and this domain. here's how it lines up with your resume, and that sort of thing. So, because my understanding is you can only have one endorser. Well, I've only ever seen one through the IC² portal.
Beauty. Thank you.
Yeah.
We'll
Cool.
get to the rest later.
Cool. So, domain one, security and risk management. So that's where we're going to start. I think some of the domains are a little bit out of order, and that's because some domains are bigger than others. But at least at the start, we're starting with domain one. So I know, as Guy, you mentioned before, I know there's going to be different levels of, kind of experience and so forth in here. So, some of you may have come across what we're about to talk about before, some of you may not. So if you have heard it all before, I'm sorry. But we'll talk about, we'll start with the very kind of fundamental stuff and then kind of progression there. So this is where it all starts. If you open any, pretty much any security book, CISSP or CEH or CISM or whatever, you're probably going to find that the CIA Triad features fairly early on. And so here we're talking about the sort of three principles of information security. And I'm sorry, sometimes I use those terms interchangeably, information security and cybersecurity, where they are slightly different, but we'll given that it's the CISSP, we'll go with information security, which is a bit more broad, and we will talk about personnel security and things like that, which kind of help extend, or at least what I would define as information security. So, including physical information and physical security and things like that. So anyway, CIA Triad, so confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so the three principles, as I said, so confidentiality is, and I love this because I didn't put any notes down on what this stuff is, so this is me testing myself. But so confidentiality is ensuring that information is only accessible by those that are authorized to see it or to have access. So pretty straightforward. Integrity is around the accuracy of information, and so preventing things like tampering and stuff like that. That is the sort of integrity principle. And then availability is that the information, and when I say information, I mean, it could be a service, but a service would generally provide information, but the information is accessible to those that need to consume it when they need to consume it. So, and we will talk about sort of threats to that, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with CIA Triad. One that I don't really hear as much, but is very relevant, is when CIA fails, right? And you end up with this DAD triad. And I'm probably going to toggle backwards and forwards. So when confidentiality fails, what you end up with is disclosure. When integrity controls fail, what you end up with is alteration. And when availability fails, then you potentially end up with destruction. And so when we think about things like, what are threats, and so I'm going backwards and forwards, threats to, confidentiality, this is where, and how to protect that, I think about things like, data breaches. So data breaches are a big one. These are big threats to confidentiality. And this is where things like, like access control and encryption are used to protect the confidentiality of information. Moving on to, integrity. This is around, accuracy of information. Once again, encryption plays a big part because encryption can, help ensure integrity. And once again, that's, controlling access so that only the right people can tamper with it, can modify it or update it or whatnot. Or, in terms of things like encryption for integrity, like hashing and stuff like that. So that's what we're talking about, integrity. And then availability, I think the big one here, well, there's two. There's obviously destruction, so destruction of data. So obviously if someone gains access to a system, they could potentially destroy data, and then that would obviously hinder availability. But also things like, denial of service and distributed denial of service. So, things like capacity. So is there sufficient capacity to handle whether it be a legitimate influx of traffic or whether it be some sort of, malicious attack, because it might be a denial of service attack. So, I mean, those are just some very high level examples. I'm sure you can think of some more, but, at the sort of core, this is really where, we think about information security and those key principles. I'm not really going to talk about the DAD, Triad, because I think it's kind of a bit self-explanatory. So anyway, very, very basic there. I probably don't need to get into too much information just because, you know, I'm sure you could think of examples of you know, threats to confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And you can also maybe start to think about controls to protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So as I said, you know, there's plenty of those. I don't think there's probably a need here to step through them. I'll give you a few examples, but you know, there's quite an endless list of those. And then in other, you know, sections throughout the next sort of 4 weeks, we will talk about more of those things. So, you know, we're going to have a specific session, you know, like on encryption and things like that, and on user access control and so forth. So this is very, very, very high level here. So I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds just yet. However, we are talking about security and risk. We've got, you know, governance is a very important element of that. And so when building out a, you know, information security program, one of the key things is looking at governance. And so this is where things like policies, standards, and procedures come into play. And so when we think about this, you know, there's this sort of, I guess, this sort of triangle where, you know, the policies, they sit at the top. And I just realized if I just keep going forward, and here when we look about policies, these are the top tier, they're very high level, and they're best described as the why. And so there are, depending on how you do this, I mean, I'm sure some of you have written policies before. I'm most certain you've read them before. But you know, what makes a good policy is that it's high level and it just kind of explains why something is needed. It doesn't have a lot of detail. And policies shouldn't change very often. You know, the ideal, I guess, best practice is that a policy is high level. It doesn't change often. It has, you know, been reviewed by senior management, you know, preferably executive senior management. And there's that sort of top-down approach in terms of getting policies reviewed and approved and implemented into an organization. And so, you know, a policy would generally be, would generally use statements like, you know, like shall and must and that sort of thing. So they'd be very kind of definitive and kind of explain why. So for example, it isn't, you know, and I don't have one here. There are many examples like SANS, the SANS Institute have some examples of policies. You know, if you, anyone that's familiar with ISO 27001, 2013, one of the standards in there, which one is it? Come to me. Is it 00? It's not 5, might be 3.
Right, here we go. We've got it maybe in the chat. Anyone want to help? ISO 2707? No.
No, I don't think it's that high. It's below 5, I'm pretty sure. I think it might be 3. Okay. It's not 1, it's not 2, and it's not 5.
Someone look it up and chuck it in the chat.
1's a standard, 2's the sort of control guidance implementation, 5 is risk management. And then there's sort of 3 and 4, and 1's around implementing the ISMS and the other one is around sort of measurement, things like that. So it's one of those. Anyway, it kind of has a very, you know, high level, almost template example of what makes a kind of good policy. And typically when I write policies, I like to make them nice and short because people need to be able to digest them and consume them. People need to read them. And so they'll say things like, it's critical for whatever, for ongoing, I don't know, operations that we protect confidential and integrity availability of information. And then it has like principles, right? We shall do this, and you shall do this, and so forth. So very, very high level. It's very, very wide driven. And so moving on, that goes down to, well, what about the what? And so this is where standards come into place, and they would have specific requirements. So best described as the what. And so within a standard, this is where, you would start to consider things like frameworks, any kind of legal, regulatory, or contractual requirements. So all this sort of stuff needs to be considered. So that's the what. So these are typically going to still be mandatory, but they provide a little bit more detail. They'll change a little bit more often, and they provide a bit more specifics on what is required. So moving on from that, you've got procedures. So procedures are really about ensuring consistent approaches. They describe the how. They will probably change more often. So, from a policy level, it might be, protections will be put in place to ensure that malware is not installed, will not infect a system. But it won't say, go and insert antivirus vendor here or anything like that, or go click next, or anything like that, right? So if you go down to that procedural documentation, this is really around the step-by-step. So for example, if I think about something like an ISO ISMS, there might be creating a new user account or verifying backups or something like that. I mean, this is going to be more procedural documentation. And this is something, especially where things are complex, where procedures are going to be valuable. They're also referred to as standard operating procedures. But yeah, it could talk about an entire system or just a particular aspect of a system. So that's procedures. And then finally, sorry, I say finally, but I've actually added another one, guidelines. So this is really around guidance recommendations. A lot of this language in here is going to be things like, should, or, should. They're generally quite flexible. It's going to be things like, trying to think of a guidance statement, but, they're not generally considered, they're not considered compulsory. They're more to promote good security practices. You're not going to get, someone's not going to get in trouble if they don't follow guidance, opposed to, like a clear desk policy, which would say, make sure there's nothing on your desk and don't put your passwords on Post-it notes and things like that. This would be a little bit, this would be far more guiding. So I'm a bit distracted as I keep getting these raised hands things. So I feel like there's going to be a schooling questions there. Now, this is not in a triangle that I just want to say that was it, but this is not a triangle from before, but just in terms of good practice, there's the concept of baselining. And so baselining is a minimum level of security that, that a system must meet. And the idea behind baselining is that, it's configured to a minimum level, generally best practice. There are many free templates. Anyone that wants to get the Microsoft baseline documents on the ACSC have some, sort of standard stuff as well. And CIS, which is the one that I've used quite a lot. What baselining does is it starts a system of a minimum state. So generally things like disabling unused services or disabling unused accounts, disabling legacy stuff, that's kind of, and then inventory of what applications are installed in a system. And what's useful about it is, the changes can be identified, which is, what they call baseline drift. And the useful thing about that, and we will get into this when we talk about asset security, is that it's really important to know what's on the systems that you have and that you're managing and that you're responsible for. So baselining is a really good way to see what varies from what the acceptable standard configuration is. And obviously, if there's a lot of drift happening, then it might be time to review that baseline. Anyway, that's those particular items in that triangle. Another thing that's mentioned a lot, sorry, it's kind of blowing through this a bit, is non-repudiation. Normally I would say, what is non-repudiation? Why is it important? But bring it up a bunch of people responding. But simply put, out of the text, non-repudiation ensures that the subject of an activity or who caused an event cannot deny that the event occurred, which means that they can't say they didn't do it or they didn't send it. When I say they, if something happened, and that could be, and an event could be something positive, it could be something negative, but an example is if someone sends a message that says, hey, please go do this, and if you think about these days with all, like email spoofing and scams and that sort of thing, there's every reason, there's every chance that, it wasn't them. But if non-repudiation controls are used, then they can't say it wasn't them because non-repudiation would ensure that it is validated that it was them. And so there are different ways to do that. And it's really important, especially in those sort of forensic situations where, let's say, an adverse thing does happen, an adverse event, and there's that whole kind of exercise of like whodunit. And so if non-repudiation controls are in place, then it's basically without a doubt going to be that particular individual or whatnot. And so in terms of like how to control that, we've got things like digital signing, we've got logging and auditing. I mean, these things are all kind of important. And then probably more recently, we're starting to see things like the use of blockchain and so forth. And blockchain being immutable has been used to as a non-repudiation control. And so this is something that I kind of feel like it's a little bit out of place, but it's something that's definitely mentioned in there. So make sure that you kind of know what it is and why it's important. And I think one of the other things that happens as well is like non-repudiation might not just be a single control. So it might be something like a digital signature in combination with another piece of information like an IP address or a system log of some description. So using multiple things to say, okay, we could basically say, yes, it was X that did this, or it wasn't. And when we talk, I think we'll talk a little bit about, in a minute, about threat modeling, and we talk about repudiation. But yeah, so non-repudiation is a fairly important element when it comes to information security, because it's really important to make sure that there's accountability. And as I said, especially in an adverse event, someone would need to be accountable otherwise, because someone's going to be asking for answers, right? Someone's going to imagine like, well, who did it? And this is where that's important. All right, so we're going to move on to threat modeling very quickly. Give me 1 second. We're not even halfway through the deck, so as I said, this is very compressed.
Yeah.
So threat modeling.
Don't worry too much. Yeah, unless you got something on.
No. So this is threat modeling. So this is the process of identifying, categorizing, and analyzing threats. As pointed out here, the best time to do threat modeling is generally at the start of a project lifecycle. So, and we will talk about this a little bit later on when we talk about development life cycles and things like that. But threat modeling, you're better off identifying threats before you build it or before you put it together. But that isn't always possible. So understand that, which is why there's these different approaches down here. But threat modeling should be done, or best be done at the start. But then there should be periodic threat modeling and analysis to see if any threats have kind of been missed or have and now present that weren't there before. And so there's a couple approaches to threat modeling. There's that sort of defensive / proactive approach, which is where, like I said, at the start of it, identifying what threats there possibly are. And then it's kind of a bit out of order, but down the bottom, we've got things like Stride, Pastar, CVSS, or in this instance, you're probably looking more at Stride. And then Pastar, Stride, for anyone, I mean, that's probably the most well-known threat modeling approach. So spoofing, tampering, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, elevation of privilege. It was developed by Microsoft back in the late 90s. It's considered the most mature, and these days it's really used to identify what can go wrong. So if you've got a system that's being that you're designing or that's about to be built, look at each of those we call it items, I guess, within this sort of Stride model. So is it possible to spoof? Is it possible to tamper? Are there any repudiation issues? Before any threats to disclosure of information, any risks of denial of service, and any possibilities of elevation of privilege. And so if you think about it, a lot of that will translate back to that those initial sort of principles. So for example, spoofing might have some impact on things like sorry, I've lost my train of thought. But things like we're not spoofing would. Integrity. I think tampering would too. And then you data denial of service. It might be an issue with availability. And then in confidentiality, information disclosure. So there's some mappings kind of back there. But yeah, as I said, using a model like that is something that should be done. So use, for example, Stride when doing a threat modeling. So proactively. And then, once in production, there might be some reactive style of threat modeling. So, or threat hunting is what usually the term that's used. So, looking for threats. And this is where I think, things like CVSS, so CVSS, I'm sure some of you have seen this before, that's the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. It was developed by NIST. And basically there's a numeric severity score. And so there's a score from 1 to 10, 10 being very bad. So obviously if you're doing, you're finding, threats, or you've got something that raises a CVSS score of 10, then that's going to be a priority. It's probably not quite that black and white. There might be something that's a 10, but it's not easily exploitable in your particular environment. So there are considerations around that. But that's just another model that's used, or another approach that's used. So I'm going to pause there for a second because I need a drink of water. And then
I got a lot of people who have been asking just throughout it, your presentation about resources and that sort of thing for the courses. It'll all be available at the course page. There's no sort of due dates or anything like that. So if you go to the course page, learn.itmasters.edu.au, you can find it all there. And don't worry, if you miss anything, you can always come back to it later.
Cool. All right. So what was next? Risk management. Oh, fun. Really important. So a lot of, what we deal with and what I deal with on a fairly daily basis, and have been for as long as I can remember now, is risk management. So if we look at, what risk is, it's the identification, evaluation, prioritization of risk. That's pretty weird, but effectively here, if you look at CERT, like they have a description. So US CERT, I think it is, they describe risk, they describe it quite negatively. So it's the combination of a threat and a vulnerability condition and the impact on the organization if that were to be exploited. But I'm going to say they look at it negatively. Risks can be positive too, which is interesting. No, it is. For example, positive risk, and I'll leave that for a minute. I'll come back to that because it's down the bottom. So looking at risk, there are, I guess, risk management is really that sort of anticipating and detecting risk, responding to changes and making sure that risk is effectively managed, so that any impact to, the organization is minimized. And there are quite a few, standards and frameworks and resources that can be used to manage risk. So the big one that many have heard of is ISO 31000, got a revision in 2018. And ISO 31000 is very broad in terms of its risk management, whereas, ISO 27005, which also got a revision in 2018, is really focused on information security risk. There's quite a lot of overlap. When building out a risk program, I typically will use 31000 because it's a little bit more broad, but 27005 is fine as well. Obviously, those two ISO standards, you have to pay for them. They're not free. So, there's other options out there like, NIST Special Publication 837. That's another one that, kind of goes into, risk management. Another really useful piece of, risk management, resourcing is the risk management toolkit. I don't think that one's free, but it's really useful because what it does that the others don't is it really goes down into a lot more detail. I think that could be useful, especially for anyone that's building out a program for the first time. As I was saying, risks can be positive, and we're going to delve into risk management a lot more in the following slides. So it's probably a little bit, because it's quite important, so it's going to be a lot more detail. So risk can be positive or negative. So positive risk, maybe it's waiting on additional budget approval, and then how might that affect the project if it's approved? I mean, that there's there might be a risk on resourcing or things like that. Another one is, what if sales of a system exceed capacity? So it's positive because you're getting more sales, but then if it exceeds capacity, then that's going to potentially have a negative impact. So there's definitely different ways to look at it. So it's not all kind of doom and gloom when it comes to risk. There are definitely some positive spins on it as well. Now, I've kind of taken this from the sort of ISO kind of point of view. But if we look at, you know, the risk management life cycle, this is the way that, I think this is from ISO 31000. We start here, little green thing, start here. So identifying risk. So, and we're going to go through each of these in a bit more detail. So we're going to identify a risk, analyze it. So we'll talk about what this is in a minute. Evaluate it, treat it, and then monitor it. So it's a life cycle. So it's like a loop. So you don't just go, okay, we've worked out what it's better treat it, and that's the end of it. You got to like monitor and continue. So I think that's the important thing, is continual monitoring of risk. And so to dig into that a little bit further, what are sources of risk? This is not exhaustive, but this is usually where I start. And so, you know, looking at things like assets. So, you know, when I say assets, I mean, them, you know, there's, you know, laptops, you know, what are the risks to those? Phones, what are the risks to those? Server infrastructure, what are the risks to those? Information assets, you know, what are the risks, any risks there? Even, you know, when things go end of life or end of support, you know, there's a lot kind of going on here. So assets is a big one. And I think it's really important to know your assets as well. And we'll talk about asset management. So all this kind of ties into the other domains as well. So look at asset management and knowing what you have. And then, you know, are there any threats? So, you know, there are things like threat intelligence feeds. You know, there's, I don't think we kind of get into, well, we might actually, maybe one or the other. Trying to think about, like, you know, things like open source intelligence, so OSINT. So if you can, you know, there are sources out there where you can gather threat intel and look at threats and what's currently out there, you know, news sources, RSS feeds, there's all sorts of different ways to do this. Looking at existing controls. So what's currently in place, is it good enough? Are there any potential risks to that? Vulnerabilities, pretty straightforward one, you know, using something like a vulnerability scanner to identify vulnerabilities, getting, you know, pen test exercises to identify vulnerabilities, you know, and then looking at things like those CVSS scores to work out if there's any particular risk there. So as I said, one of the important things there is, and we'll talk about that when we look at analysis and evaluation, is if something comes up with a CVSS score of 10, is that a 10 to you? One story, I remember many years ago, doing a pen test exercise, and I remember the vulnerability scanner tool, which typically would just run first to see if there's anything out there, flagged an unauthenticated file share at this particular client as low risk, because it didn't have context, right? It didn't know what was there. It just said, oh, I see something, but hey, you know, this vulnerability scanner said, I see something, but hey, it doesn't look like anything. But it was full of confidential files. So in fact, that was much higher risk. So that's where, you know, you can't just point and shoot and say, I ran a vulnerability scanner, it's all low. You've got to kind of look a bit more detail. Consequence. So, you know, what's the outcome of doing that? If there's a risk, if a vulnerability or whatever is realized, or, you know, threat is realized, and what's the consequence of doing that? What is the risk of doing that? Or what's the risk of that happening? So, you know, there's just some risk sources there. Like I said, not exhaustive, but a good place to start. A lot of times I've seen, you know, risk registers that just kind of say, oh yeah, you know, legacy Windows, or need to install a patch, but they don't have that bigger picture of risk. They're not looking more broadly, they're not looking more higher level as well, and saying, okay, well, what is the risk to the organization? Analysis and evaluation. So the next thing here is looking at, you know, analyzing and evaluation of risk. So this is where we start talking about things like risk appetite, risk tolerance, and risk limit. So when we go, and we're going to talk about calculating risk shortly, but effectively an organization is going to determine, and this usually comes from senior management, hopefully, what amount of risk the organization is willing to aggregate, and that is the appetite. And then, you know, for each system there might be a tolerance level, and that's going to vary typically. So, you know, one system you might be able to accept more risk, for example, a system that doesn't contain any sensitive information, it's all public or whatever, or it's not really used, and, you know, you're probably willing to have a higher risk tolerance than something that is mission critical, which is going to have a lower risk tolerance. And then you've got that minimum risk level before further actions are taken. And so working out these metrics and saying, okay, well, this is the number that we're going to assign to this. And obviously these scales vary between organizations, but then they need to tie in to the risk calculations, which I said we'll talk about in a minute. And then, for example, if something exceeds a particular limit, then this is where controls are applied to reduce that risk to within acceptable limits. And that's when we're going to talk about treatment later on. So hopefully I'm not jumping around too much and that the lines are kind of being drawn. So one of the key things is in terms of analysis and evaluations, calculating risk. And there's really two ways to calculate risk, and that's qualitatively or quantitatively. And I put here, can you put a value on it? And I know from working with a lot of boards and so forth that quantitative risk tends to be more valuable just because it's better. Like if you could put a dollar figure on something versus saying, well, and when I say it out now, it's kind of like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. By saying, well, the risk is high, and you always get, how do you figure that, right? Whereas if you could put or what does that mean? High, or low, or very low. Whereas if you could put a number on it, so if you do a quantitative risk analysis and come out with an actual figure, that's better. We're going to talk about that. So quantitative risk. I just skip forward because the formulas are here. So these are the formulas that are typically used for calculating quantitative risk. And so we have this SLE equals AV times EF. So SLE is single loss expectancy. So single loss expectancy is what the cost of one adverse event occurring would be for that particular asset. And so the way that that's calculated, and it's funny because when you think about it, some of this stuff kind of feels a little bit qualitative, but anyway. So if you know that, something costs, we go to asset value. And so asset value is like, what is the asset worth? So put a number on it. And then exposure factor, this is where I find it's a little bit, almost a little bit qualitative, but what is the percentage of damage? So for example, if an asset is worth 100 grand, and if a adverse event were to occur and it were to damage 30% of the asset, so 0.3, then the single loss expectancy would be $30,000. Cool, easy. Great, so if it happens once, costs 30 grand. Now we have the ALE. So what is the annual loss expectancy? Once again, single loss expectancy, in this example, $30,000. How many times do you think it's going to happen per year? Now you're probably thinking, well, how are you going to put a number on that? And there's going to be instances where you can, and a lot of times where you can't. An instance where you can is, perhaps it might be because you have storms that come through at a certain time per year, or earthquakes, or something else that could be maybe predictable, or maybe there's some sort of other analytics that are taking place. But if you can work that out and say, okay, well, it happens 3 times per year, then you'll know that if the single loss expectancy is $30,000 and it happens 3 times per year, then every year it's going to cost $90,000. At which point you're like, okay, well, we should probably do something about that because we're basically going to totally lose the asset. One thing that we'll talk about is, obviously the cost of treatment, which is important too. But that's quantitative risk assessment. So you're putting a number on it. Yes, there's a little bit of sort of subjectiveness, and there kind of has to be, unless you've got data. I mean, if you've got historic data that can actually back it up, then great. But a lot of the time, you might need to put in a few assumptions. I mean, things like asset value are pretty easy. Like, you get a finance, say, well, how much does this thing cost? Where it's things like reputational risk or, cost of a particular information asset, that might be a little bit more difficult unless you can calculate what the effort would be to rebuild that. So yeah, I mean, these computations can get pretty massive. But yeah, I mean, I usually find in this sort of business, finance is a good place to start if you're trying to work out, like, what a server costs to replace, or whatever it is. Whereas some stuff is a bit more vague. Quantitative is a little bit qualitative is a bit easier, because you don't really do any calculations. It's very, very subjective. It's basically saying, well, and the funny thing is, I always say when people go, oh, we'll just do it this way, I said, yeah, we can't just say that everything is possible and that consequence is probably high. Like, we can't just have everything in the middle. Just like when it's a scale of 1 to 5, we can't just make everything 3. So otherwise you're gonna have everything 3. But this is another way to do it. This requires sort of subject matter expertise and someone going, okay, well, based on what I as an expert know, I think this is going to be a rare occurrence, but if it does happen, then it's going to be catastrophic, depending on what it is. And so this is that qualitative thing. The other thing that happens a lot here is you can assign values to this so that you're actually spitting out a number, not usually a dollar figure, but just like a ranking. So saying, if it's very low, then maybe it's like or sometimes it's multipliers. So like rare is 1, unlikely 2, 3, 4, and then you got 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you multiply or add up. That happens, or that's done a lot too, to try and get a value, and then that value is used against those limits. So you could say that well, if it's almost certain and it's catastrophic, and so it's like 5 times 5, whatever it is, and it ends up being 25, and your risk limit is like 10, then that that's something that you need to reduce or provide some other sort of treatment, which we'll talk about in about 5 seconds. Cool. So risk treatment. So prioritizing risk treatment. So it's really important, and that's done by identifying what the risk is and trying to get those metrics against it. As I said, working out context, really important, and then developing treatment plans. So how are you going to do this? Are you going to implement controls or whatnot? And you've got these various options here. So this is the important stuff here. So, well, it's all important, but yeah. So in terms of treatment options, you're going to mitigate the risk. You're going to assign or transfer the risk, accept it, avoid it, deter or reject it. Now we'll talk about these quick. So mitigating the risk. So this is generally involves implementing a control, right, of some sort. So for example, if you need to mitigate the risk of, brute force attacks, then implement 2FA. That's a good start. Cool, easy. And now what's the risk level? Have we reduced it enough? Yes, no. One example. Transfer the risk. This is usually done a lot with things like reputational risk. This is where you look at insurance policy. So can I insure it? The answer is yes, then you're transferring the risk to another party. That's a good example of transferring the risk. You can accept the risk, in which case, well, it's within appetite or whatnot, or there's another reason why you might accept it, which is that the cost to treat the risk, we talked about quantitative calculations earlier, but if the cost to treat the risk or to mitigate it exceeds what the value of the asset is, then it might not be sensible to pay more to reduce the risk than what it's worth. Generally, you wouldn't do that. Like a board wouldn't go, well, it's 100 grand. If we lose it, it's going to cost us $1 million to control it. Let's do that. Said no one ever. So this is where you might just accept it. Avoiding it might be, for example, if it was a project and the risk was high, avoiding would be just not doing it. That's risk avoidance. Deterring might be, and deterring is an interesting one. It's not really mitigating it, but it's more so putting in deterrence control. So things like cameras, auditing, banners, warning, this is a authorized access only. You'll be prosecuted under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So that's an American one, but that's a deterrence. And the last one, which is worth talking about, is reject the risk. So this is basically where you put your hands over your ears and go, no, it doesn't exist. It's very bad. Don't do that. This one could be considered negligent. So if there's a risk and you just choose to ignore it, that's a bad idea. So, but hey, it's actually mentioned in the text as well. So yeah, don't do that. think that was it on risk. I'm going to move over to personnel security now. So I'm going to pause, have another sip of water.
Must stay hydrated. There's a lot of good questions too. So we'll probably be, what, another 10 minutes on the rest of the slides, and then we'll get into questions. I don't know, just guessing with the slide deck, maybe a little bit more.
Yeah. 30 or 39. Although I think 39 doesn't count. I think that's a thank you slide. Cool. Personnel security. People are often considered the weakest link. Yeah, those poor people on their weakest link. But hey, I mean, it's been going around. I mean, the security folk have been saying it forever, weakest link. But hey, they could also be a very strong link. But yes, I mean, the manipulation of people to achieve a goal from a threat actor perspective is just everywhere. Like, it is everywhere. And I'm sure probably every single person that's on this Zoom has seen it. So there's been a massive increase in those people-centric attacks. We've seen phishing, which is the email-based attacks. We've seen vishing, which is voice. I'm sure you may have received some of those funny phone calls. And then smishing. Starting to see those. Like that. If you're in Australia, you see all those like DHL ones. Hey, your package has arrived, but you never ordered anything. And so we're gonna, look at that. And then, you've also got insider threats. And insider threats, they could be malicious or they could be accidental. You're thinking, how is an insider threat accidental? How can you be an accidental insider? Well, that's easy. You're just doing something because you're trying to get your job done, or you did something by accident, but it still creates a security event. So, for example, putting stuff on a USB stick that's unencrypted and leaving it in a taxi would be considered an accidental insider. Or, people, funnily enough, people falling for phishing campaigns. I mean, those are kind of accidental insider type scenarios. Or my favorite, the email system is too slow. I'll just email all this confidential stuff using my Gmail account. That's also considered a potential security event. So, there are different types of situations here that need to be handled. And so in terms of, mitigating controls, the big one is security awareness and education. There are plenty of security awareness and education platforms out there that can help with this. And you can obviously build your own, but I don't know, not that expensive generally, depending on your budget. But it's really important that security awareness and education is practiced. Yes, you could also put things in like, when we talk about phishing and credential harvesting and things like that, there are other controls that can help mitigate that, like multi-factor authentication and things like, enabling impossible travel. And so impossible travel is where you go to log in and the system detects that you're suddenly a long way from where you were, and it's possible that you could have got that amount of time. That's probably dodgy. It'll block the access. There's multiple different ways to do it. But preventing the problem before that is definitely a better approach. And I think we'll probably talk about password hygiene at some point. It's pretty common that people reuse passwords. I'm not going to say everyone put your hand up that has reused a password, because no one would do that here. But the fact is it does happen. So you don't want those things disclosed in the first place. So it's better to not do that. Now, sometimes they're just information, soliciting things where, threat actors try and work out who's who in the zoo, I guess, and then use that information to try and launch some other type of scam. Conducting things like phishing tests and social engineering tests, really good way to validate people's awareness and education. So in terms of phishing tests, sending those scam emails and getting people to, provide their credentials or do something like that. Social engineering tests, where, I guess that's kind of part of phishing tests, but also in terms of getting access to, buildings and things like that, to see if they can, tailgate people in. There's all sorts of different types of social engineering tests or convincing people to plug things in. These are usually part of either the security awareness training platforms or engaging consultants or whoever to do external testing or social engineering testing. And the other key control in terms of personnel security that's becoming more and more prevalent, I've seen it for quite some time in the US. I think in Australia it's gained a lot more, especially as people implement things like ISO 27001, but it's background screening. So background screening and candidate screening is probably something that's a lot more prevalent than it was several years ago. But that's another good control in terms of preventing or helping to mitigate. Doesn't prevent, but helping to identify any potential issues. Yeah, super quick on that one. So one thing to note is the CISSP is issued by C-Squared, as I said, and it's a US-based organization. So consequentially, many of the laws and legislation, laws and regulations that are referred to within the CISSP are US. So just kind of be aware of that. Now, look, I haven't sat the recent exam, so not that I would be allowed to anyway, in terms of disclosing what's on it. But I could say that with the previous exam at least, because there were, without saying what they are, there were some questions from memory around particular relevant laws. So there are three categories of law, which I'll cover really quick: civil, criminal, administrative law. And so civil law, is dealing with injury to an individual or private party like a corporation. So we look at things like slander and contract law, negligence, that sort of stuff. That usually falls into that. Criminal law, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, and then administrative law, which is what governs government decision making. And so what we'll find is a lot of the laws here are probably going to fall within things like administrative law or criminal law. So these aren't really going to be civil categories. And so the key, I guess, relevant laws, or some relevant laws that I've just sort of flagged here, we've got the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is a US one. So this is the one that's used to prosecute anyone that commits sort of computer crimes. If anyone's aware or been around or whatnot when the Morris worm went around, but I think his name was Robert Morris. So the Morris worm was back in the 80s. He was the first person to be, I think he was the first person to be tried and convicted against the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. But then, we've got, more recently, and so these first lot here are US based, so the Infrastructure Protection Act and the FISMA, HIPAA. In Australia, we've got the Australian Privacy Act 1988, which also has the Notifiable Data Breach Scheme Amendment 2018. There's a few others now. We've got the that have come about. We've got some critical infrastructure laws and things like that. But I think for this for the CISSP, I'd probably be more familiar with things like the CFAA, Patriot Act, Cloud Act, ITAR, that sort of thing. Maybe the Copyright Act. So those are probably HIPAA. Having said that, I think what's also important with ISC² is they also, I didn't mention it earlier, they have like specialisms. So you've got CISSP, but you've also got specialisms for like, management, but then they've also got other certifications that focus on things like, health, just thinking of HIPAA. But yeah, it's still good to have some familiarity, not to the level of like reading it, memorizing it, but just kind of knowing what law would apply in a particular situation. It's probably good just to be across that.
Hey George.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Just with those other certifications, like,
yeah,
I guess when would people do one of those over the CISSP? Like, because this is the only one we really cover in depth with our subjects. Like, is it simply just like a question of your favorite sort of area, and then you would target a job in it? Would you do the CISSP first, like, or just like if you hoping to get stepping up into a management role, would you go that, or is it like technical versus management?
Yes, look, I think that the CISSP is probably the most broad of the certifications. It probably covers the most amount of knowledge more broadly. Whereas, for example, CCSP, which is the cloud security certified cloud security practitioner, professional, focuses on cloud. There's the health one that focuses on health. There's other ones that focus on software development, whereas this one's a lot more broad. Generally, like in my experience, people that are looking at more sort of management roles will generally look at the CISSP, I think, because it has that really broad knowledge requirement. But yeah, it really depends. Whereas there might be some people that are really starting early in their career, and they might not want to go through the CISSP because it's so big and broad, and they might look at something like the SSCP. So there's quite a few. I mean, the best bet is to look at IC squared and have a look at each of the certifications. As I said, the CISSP is kind of considered the gold standard. I think that's one that everyone tries to go for. It's probably definitely the most popular, I would have thought. And yeah, it has the most broad coverage. So you kind of need to know a little bit about a lot, opposed to specifically specializing in a specific area.
Yeah, no doubt. Thanks a lot. I suppose that they definitely have people who you could talk to if you're worried about which one's best for you given your objectives.
Yeah, exactly. Funny thing is, that's actually the last slide, because I just realized it's just his readings. So that was it. That was a lot to get through, and it's fairly condensed.
Yeah, well
I'm sorry it feels like we're kind of jumping through it really quickly, but as I said, this is kind of, I think, where I think if you want to do like a boot camp, you kind of go through this over like 4 to 5 full days, not 4 to 5 hours. So I definitely would recommend, if you can get the book or do some additional readings. And I said there's some kind of, they'll be posted up in the IT Masters portal there. That will definitely help.
Yeah, mighty effort, and it's always hardest with the first one with all the intro stuff. So yeah, well done. We have loads of questions, of course, but as we always say, like there's recordings available, so if you need to head off, that's okay, but stick around if you can. Let's go for a couple that were fairly recent. There was a lot of talk when you were going through the physical security slides, sort of 31 and 32. Evelyn's wondering whether, or says CISSP does not appear to cover this aspect very well. And in terms of accreditation, the risk to the ones and zeros, so to speak, is from those people given access to domains and not monitored to ensure breaches of info security. Would you agree that it's sort of that's a domain that's sort of underrepresented, or are there any that that you think they could focus more on?
Is there any way I can read the question? Where's that?
Let's have a look.
Do I need to keep sharing? No.
No, yeah, feel free to stop sharing if it helps with the questions. I'll just mark the one that I'm talking about, answer live. It's sort of 8:34 p.m.
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot. There we go. 8:34. Evelyn, CISSP does appear to cover it. In terms of accreditation. Yeah, look, I think it's a good point. So this is referring to personnel security.
Yeah, this was physical security, but also personnel security. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think the physical security. It's in. It's covered. I think it's. I can't remember what domain it is. But yeah, there's not. Yeah, the bulk of it is not that, I guess. So the focus really is on data. And as I said, like the deck's kind of taken from a lot of the resources within the text and so forth. And yeah, I don't think there's a huge. It's very important. And to be honest, in the real world, I think it's probably the one thing that I struggled with the most, especially when people, I think around sort of 2014, I was around 2014, 2013, there seemed to be this flip from information security to cybersecurity, and the focus really kind of moved over to more of the kind of virtual domain opposed to the sort of physical. So maybe that's reflected in that. But yeah, I think that's a good point, because physical is very important. We are also organizations trying to move away from physical files, but and physical information, but it does still exist. And I think at the end of the day, it's really important, because if an organization doesn't secure their physical perimeters and someone gets in there and gets access to systems, well, that's a massive issue in itself. Don't know if that answered the
No,
question.
that's great. Thank you. Couple of questions about other certifications in there and other vendors. For people that are less experienced, where would you sort of suggest people start a certification journey? There's a lot of talk of CompTIA in here, maybe with the Network Plus or Security Plus.
Yeah, look, honestly, my first security cert was Security Plus. Way back, I don't remember when it was. It was very good. It was like it, and funnily enough, so I did Security Plus. I did CEH. Those were two. I did those very early on, and I think they were good in terms of kind of learning the sort of the lingo and kind of getting a good basis for InfoSec. I did the CISSP after that, and I mean, when I say it was a while ago, like it was still a paper exam. Like I remember coloring in circles on a Scantron. Actually the CISSP was actually, so the CISSP was the ISACA one, Certified Information Security Manager. I remember the two massive challenges with the exam. One was that the content was actually quite difficult. Two was that my fingers were cramping up from coloring in all those little circles. Oh, it was shocking. But by kind of doing that and going, Security Plus, CH, CISSP, I think I did a GIAC one in there as well. GIAC is the ones from the SANS Institute. So I did the continuous monitoring one for SOC people. And I did that because it was new and work paid for it at the time. And I lived in the States, so because some of you are thinking, well, those are really expensive, and they are, but they're very good. And I did all those, and then when I finally went and did the CISSP, I found the CISSP for me, just because I'd done all this other stuff, I felt like I was worried about nothing. Like I was freaking out because people were thinking, oh, it's hard. And then I had one guy going, it took me 6 hours. And I'm like, oh my God, this is not going to be fun. And I was like, this is okay. And I kind of went through, and yeah, I can't remember the exact time, but it was just over 2 hours to do the 6-hour exam, because I think I'd learned a lot of it, and a lot of it carried over. So, I mean, obviously you could start with the CISSP and do that exam, but having started with, as I said, Security Plus, was a good place to start for me. I already had the network knowledge and that sort of thing, so I didn't really start with the network. I think Network Plus, but yeah, that's what I did.
Yeah, so. And really, there's no right or wrong certification. It's always a question of what your objectives are, who's paying. I think is another big thing. Like as you say, no doubt your workplace will have a preferred certification that they want to advertise their consultants have, and all that sort of stuff.
And you're right, a big part of it is where you want to go in InfoSec, because InfoSec is and cybersecurity is such a broad field. If you're going to become a pen tester, then you might not want to do the CISSP, because there are other certifications, like there's some from CREST and some from OSCP and things like that are going to be more relevant to that. So yeah, it really depends where you want to have your career go. Yeah.
Just to let everyone know, we've cut questions off as well. So any you send in, Hannah will just get rid of, so we don't stay here until 100 o'clock. We got to let people go. Quick one, does the CISSP give you a mark or just a pass or fail?
I haven't sat the exam recently, but my understanding was it was a pass or fail. So there was I think, I can't remember the exact number. I can see if I can find it. I think it's like 700 or something. So it's like 70%. I don't quote me on that. I've got to check. But then I think if you go above it, I don't think it tells you from memory. It just says you passed. So yeah, there is I think there was a lot of, and it obviously doesn't tell you what you got wrong either, or what you got right. It's very much congratulations. So I remember doing it thinking I go to the printer and, they kind of go, here you go. And I'm like, oh, and I flip it over. It's like, oh, congratulations. Like, yes. But, I know if you do the old Microsoft exams, it'll be like, oh, you like 860 or 930 or 695 or 690 is like sad because that's fail. But yeah, that I don't recall that in the CISSP exam. ISACA do give you a score. I do know that, but I don't think IC squared do.
Okay, very good. And I think also with IC squared, depending on the exam, they have different percentages, which is really annoying for people like me who don't actually know anything about it and just have to do the credit checks for people coming in later. Would we consider multi-factor authentication as digital signing?
No, I don't. But
good. We'll just whip through them. That's okay. Anything that we sort of cover too quickly and has maybe been a bit flippant with, just let us know, and we can go in more depth later. Victor wants to know why data not being available is considered a security issue.
Data not being available. So it's a security. So the idea is that when you think about that CIA triad and availability, so you've got a few things here. As I said, one is around not disclosing information, and one is around making sure it's accurate, and the other one is around availability of information. So it's really, I think, about making sure that operations aren't impeded by an adverse event. So it's considered I guess a security a security requirement, because you would use you're no longer able to access information or access a system, and so it's probably a horrible explanation, but availability is just one of those things. It's like key. So if you can't access it and it's destroyed, for example, and look at was it 2012? We had distribute IT, and it's a well publicized example of where a threat actor destroyed data and it was no longer accessible, and subsequently the organization failed. So that's, once again, I guess I'm trying to use examples of where it's important to secure an organization properly so that data is available, and it's available so that it doesn't impede operations. I guess that's pretty much it, because then what ends up happening is if operations are impeded, then that may impact the continuity of that business.
Yeah. I imagine if we couldn't let any of you into this webinar.
Well, yeah, exactly. Or if all my slides got deleted.
There's a few questions here about I guess which tool is best, which risk standard or framework is best. For all those sorts of I guess preference questions, I'm just going to say that's what the forums are for. Really, most of the answers will be, it depends on your context and your objectives and your appetite and all that sort of thing. So that would be a really great place to chuck a few questions in the forums and just sort of, thrash it out amongst yourselves, and we'll jump in if there's anything that we can add. So that we'll get rid of tools or software programs question from Ahmed. While I'm getting rid of those ones, Dan's asking, why is threat hunting considered reactive?
Well, it's reactive because the threat's already there. So what you're doing is you're trying to identify I guess vulnerabilities and weaknesses after the fact. So it's reactive from that perspective, opposed to doing it up front. And I kind of get it, because you're kind of saying, well, we've identified it before a threat actor has identified that particular threat and has exploited it. But I guess because it already exists, it's it's considered reactive.
Okay, great.
Well, that was my interpretation anyway. So.
Well, that's what we're here for. Yeah, go for it. Craig's wondering whether you find in general that there's a gap with calculating return on investment on security as a whole, because there's just that lack of quantitative data. It was really interesting discussion earlier before.
Short answer, yes. I do find that that's difficult, and I think it makes it really difficult as well when you're trying to get budget, because it's hard. Like getting quantitative data is I've found always really difficult. I mean, as I said, you can work out the cost of an asset, but then unless you've got the means to identify what historic data for something, like what did it cost last time this happened, God, you don't want a last time that happened. You certainly don't want a next time. So yeah, I do find that quantitative and calculating return on investment is difficult. Yeah, I think that's it. It's the ideal scenario is you can calculate those figures and you can provide some solid numbers, but yeah, it's really, really hard. I got a friend of mine that developed a platform that kind of does that, and it calculates quantitative risk and that sort of thing. I don't know if he's on this. I don't know. I don't think he knows. I don't think he knows this on
yourself.
Yeah, I don't think he's on here. I mean, he's in the US anyway, so he's probably asleep, or just waking up. But there's a lot of inputs, and I'm like, where do I even get this data from? Because there was so much, dollar figures I needed. Like I need to spend 2 weeks with the finance team just to get a little bit of it. But then, what does an incident cost? I mean, yeah, you can work out some of it, but once again, accuracy. So you get a lot of questions, probably end up creating more questions. So yeah, always a hard one. Qualitative is so much easier, but then you get another million questions. So the risk is high. We should do something. Like, how do you figure that? I don't know. I just know it is. So
yeah, and that's why it's so important, as you were saying earlier, just to have the agenda sort of set by the people that are making those sorts of decisions. And unless you want to go for a career where you're the person making that sort of decision, then good on you.
Yeah, you still report to somebody else.
Yeah.
That's what I find.
Yeah, okay.
Then the shareholders go, but why?
Yeah, right. Yeah, tough one, Craig. If you can answer it, thanks. James Zobrist, wonder if relation to Steve, one of our trainers, what are some real practical strategies in eliminating wrong answers on the CISSP exam? I've heard all of the strategies around, like think like a manager or think endgame. Those by themselves haven't helped James. I guess first question is, will we? I guess just we'll certainly have a little bit of a discussion about the practicalities of the exam, like right at the end there. We'll say gives you some tips and some good resources. But can you think of any off the top of the head, George?
Yeah, not that's going to be particularly helpful, because I know that when I did it, I kind of used that strategy. I was like, well, how would I answer this if I was a manager? I mean, I avoided the technical answer, and it worked. That's not really useful because you said don't use that. So sorry, it's not really helpful. But and to be fair, I mean, I did my exam like 7 years ago. But that's what I did. It's like if I put my management hat on. And what was interesting, which is a good point, is because I did the CISM first, that was very, very management focused, and I think a lot of that helped. The funny thing with the CISM is it was management focused and it was ISACA focused, so it was kind of like, well, it was super frustrating because you'd end up with like multiple choice, but like 2 to 3 of the answers were valid. You're like, well, this is annoying. So which one is it? And it was like, well, which one is it if I answered it like I was them? And it was that one. So that was always fun. But yeah, that sort of management thinking and what's in the best interest of the organization and that sort of stuff, and the ongoing sort of operation of the organization was usually worked for me. Because I remember that in the exam there was questions there. I'm like, well, if I put my engineering hat on, I would do this. But if I was a manager, I would do that. Which was like not go and buy whatever and put it in. So I don't know the answer, but I do remember that situation, and so I definitely took that approach, and it worked. I mean, I managed to get through first go without any issues.
So is it fair to say that a lot of people might actually put something in that they might even disagree with, and it would be the correct answer, like deliberately to pass the exam?
It was definitely a different way of thinking. It was definitely not a going straight into solution mode. You know, where there was a question where it was like, you could do solution mode X, or you could do something else that was also correct, but sounded more management-like. That was generally I think, once again, you don't know because they don't tell you, but there's a few of those, and unless they were all the ones I got wrong. Yeah, as I said, I managed to get through issues. So.
Yeah, good luck, James, I think is the answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's overly helpful, but
yeah, well, I guess all we can say is, you know, like Scar and The Lion King, be prepared. Great song, and probably good advice. Let's finish with Ed. Since people are always the weakest link in security, is hiring people a form of risk rejection? Thank you, Ed. There's always one. I love it.
Yeah.
Points awarded for funnies.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a gold star for that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you don't know that before they start.
Well, unless you have good policies in place, and but even then, that's tough. They can lie.
No, I think honestly, it's kind of it's actually a pretty good question, because the answer would be, well, yeah, which is why you need to do security awareness training and putting mitigated controls to make sure that you're not rejecting the risk and that you're doing something about it. So
2 gold stars, Ed.
There you go. Put them on security awareness training.
Yeah, beauty.
Test
them.
Hey,
George, good job. Thanks heaps. That was fun and really interesting. What are we doing next week? We're having more webinar. I won't be here, but someone will be emceeing from IT Masters. I'd like to thank Hannah and Kit and anyone else from IT Masters for listening along and for making these things happen, and everyone for sticking around. There's still hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of you out there, so good on you. And if you're listening along to a recording later on and you couldn't get in, sorry for that. We've got a cap of 1,000. We're doing the best we can with a free short course budget. And of course, thanks heaps, George. That was really, really interesting. I'm really excited to be doing a CISSP course. It's going well.
You're going to do the exam?
Yeah, I love doing these exams and just like doing the, you know, saying, what did he say in week 1? What did he say in week 2? I get access to all of the resources, folks. So the answer perhaps to James's question is you have to cheat.
I definitely don't endorse cheating. But anyway, so yeah, look, next week, yeah, we'll cover off asset security and security architecture and engineering. So only 2 domains next to it. I think most of them are 2, except for the last week, which is 3. But yeah, anyway, look forward to it. And yeah, go forth and do the quiz.
Thanks. Night.